This webinar is being hosted by TMN, the Missional Network, and Forge Canada. And you will see Alan Roxburgh and Fiona Watts in front of you. They are part of the Missional Network team. And we're located here in Vancouver, Canada. And we have been together in different ways over a decade. And we work primarily with leaders, church leaders, and church systems. And we are working alongside of them, helping them cultivate congregations that are discovering the mission of God and joining in that mission in their neighborhoods. So this was an exciting opportunity for us to join with Cam here in Vancouver, a bit of a West Coast conversation in some ways for us, and a real desire to work together and find ways of connecting across Canada as we respond to what's going on in our churches and in our world right now together.
And Sarah Jane, from a Forge perspective, we're delighted to work with you guys and believe that, your purpose, our purpose, we're so in sync, particularly on some of the stuff that we're doing right now, that we're just thrilled, and it's just worked out really, really well. Forge has also been working in Canada for about 20 years. And working with churches, leaders, denominations, and planters around, we'd love to see a missional community in every neighborhood across the country. And so we're working towards that end. Also, just want to welcome Marilyn to the call. We're going to get to hear from Alan and Marilyn a little bit later, but Marilyn from Tyndale is here and we'll introduce her a little bit more. So one of the things that's great about, I think, this call is there are so many people from different countries, Wales and England and Germany and the States. But at the heart of this, it's a lot of us Canadians, and we're trying to have a Canadian conversation. And so I'm excited to hear from people all across the country today. So that's our goal today. Thanks,
Cam. So a quick note on what we're going to be up to then, and then just a reminder about logistics, and we'll launch in. So what we're going to be up to today is a listening together and discerning together about where we are right now. And how we're going to do that together is, first, we're going to listen to God through the text. So we're going to dwell together in the Emmaus Road text. So dwelling is similar to Lectio. It's a Lectio practice, and Fiona will be leading us through that. So the first thing we'll do is listen to God through the text. The second thing we're going to do is listen to God through each other's stories. Where are we now? What are some of the stories that are bubbling up, and what can we learn from those stories about what God is up to amongst us right now? So that's the second thing we'll be doing, listening to God through one another's stories. And then the third thing we will do is listen to God through question and conversation. And that will be Alan and Marilyn, who will take the lead in that. And we have some questions for them, and we'll invite you in the chat also to be involved. And we're going to do some reflecting out of the text, out of the stories, out of our experiences, what's going on right now, and where is God, and how can we be listening and discerning to what God is up to amongst us now at this time. So that's just a brief piece on the agenda. We are going to be including you in each one of those pieces. The dwelling is quite interactive. So if you are not yet in the chat, we'd invite you to be in the chat, and also to make sure that you pull down that little blue button and that you're chatting with all panelists and attendees so that we can all hear and see and read what you are up to. So I believe that takes us to our dwelling. What I'm going to do, just before I pass it over to Fiona, who is going to lead us in this, is I'm just going to, in the chat here to you all, post a PDF. So if you've not yet had a chance to, I'd encourage you to click on that PDF. It was sent in an email, the reminder email, an hour ago and a day ago. But if you've not yet had a chance, I just encourage you to download the PDF, just read it on your screen, and it will have the tool you need, the scripture and the questions that we will need for dwelling. So Fiona, would you like to lead us?
Thanks. It's wonderful to be with you all today. I'm just noticing at the bottom of the screen that we have 85 participants at the moment. So a lot of folks with us today. We're going to spend a few minutes dwelling in the Emmaus Road text. And as Sarah Jane said, there is a link there in the chat if you would like to follow along. For those of you who aren't familiar with the dwelling practice, it's a very simple practice where we just bring all of who we are and all that's happening right now around us to the text and listen to what God has to say to us through the text in this time. We're going to read it through twice and with some silence in between. And after that, we'll invite you to share your reflections about how the text is speaking to you today. So I'm just going to share my screen with you all so you can see the questions that we'd like you to be listening through as we go through the text. I just need to move a few things around. Okay, so the questions for you to be listening to the text through are: where did your imagination stop? Are there words, phrases, ideas that grasp you? And how do you think the Spirit of God might be nudging you? So those are the questions to be listening through as the text is read. So I'm going to ask Sarah Jane to read it first, and then we're going to have a little bit of silence, and then Cam will read it for us a second time. We'll hold a little bit of silence after that, and then encourage you to share your reflections in the chat. Sarah Jane, you want to go ahead?
Absolutely. Luke 24:13-35, the walk to Emmaus. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" And they replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. The word of the Lord.
Let's hear this text a second time. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days? He asked them, What things? They replied, The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb, found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on, but they urged him strongly, saying, Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over. So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon. Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of bread.
So where did your imagination stop? Are there words, phrases, ideas that grasp you? How do you think the Spirit of God might be nudging you today? We'll look for your reflections in the chat. It always takes a minute for those first fast typists to share their reflections in the chat. Here we go. Jody says, I heard they stood there looking sad. Cam's comment, I was caught by the phrase, how slow of heart, as if they lack trust and courage. Sounds familiar. Jesus opened the scripture. Oh, there's stood still and we're sad again.
Mm-hmm.
Are you the only stranger who does not know? Their eyes were kept from recognizing him a couple of times. That's where people have landed today.
That was for Chris again. Yeah, I wonder what keeps me in the church from seeing Jesus in our midst, recognizing.
He interpreted to them things about himself in all the scriptures. Would love to have heard that. Yeah.
Julianne, they were talking with each other, trying to sort it out, the processing they were doing on the way, right?
Yeah. Whose eyes can be opened? Again, are you the only one who doesn't know what happened?
But we had hoped. Craig.
Were not our hearts burning? The stay with us statement, yep. Again,
Jesus
the question
came
about
near. Yeah.
eyes open. How do we have our eyes open when he's walking with them and they didn't even see him? How Jesus was recognized in the breaking of the bread in a simple everyday part of life and community was when Jesus was noticed and seen. Yep.
stay with us, the coming, the invitation for Jesus to come, and that he went with them.
These things kept being repeated. Were not our hearts burning?
John points out something we heard the other day too. Their eyes were opened and then he vanished.
Mm.
Oh.
James reflects on imagining hearing the cosmic story, history of creation through Jesus's teaching at the time.
Kathy too, in the breaking, telling the story to one another, the community gathering to try to make sense of things. Lynn, we hoped he would redeem.
Our question, are there people among us who will have an encounter with Jesus without knowing him, and might we be invited to help open their eyes to see him? There's a wondering about why he vanished. And the idea about Jesus walking ahead as if you were going to go on.
More burning hearts.
Oh, here's a comment. I was struck by the word then and the contrast that occurred to what they were feeling.
Oh, that was good.
Wondering about why it took the bread for them to recognize Jesus and it wasn't the burning of their heart. Oh, interesting.
David, again, that verse 28, he acted as if he would go ahead.
And the walking alongside without being known. Wondering if Jesus would have gone on if they were just satisfied with the cognitive info and didn't beg him to stay.
This is great. Jesus' question suggests he had not heard what had happened in Jerusalem. He just experienced it, literally. Yeah.
They invited a stranger to come and stay with them only to find he wasn't a stranger at all. And how Jesus entered the conversation.
Oh,
Just what are you discussing with each other?
Yeah, after Jesus left, they didn't stay, but they went to tell others.
I'm just wondering what expectation that they had prevented them seeing him as Jesus.
And Dawn, I wonder how they knew he was a stranger.
Maybe they would have stayed if Jesus had stayed. Perhaps that's why he left, so that they would leave and go and tell people.
Rob says he interpreted the things about himself. It takes Jesus to interpret Jesus. That's good.
A moment in which Jesus is known is a sacramental moment. David says, I centered on the word strongly in the phrase, but they urged him strongly to stay with them. I wonder what the author was trying to emphasize. If they walked with one another for 7 miles, there must have been a lot they discussed, right? Answering and asking questions. That's a lot of conversation over 7 miles.
Yeah, Dawn, again, it's interesting that by Jesus questioning the two, it caused them to have to speak and own their own hopes about Jesus. Hebrew Scripture 101. It might be advanced. I'm not sure. Even more advanced than 101.
Julianne wonders, it occurred to me that their sarcastic comment about him not knowing might say something about the approach we have with others. Rich reflects that Jesus knew their hearts and was leading them in their personal discovery. There's so much in this text, and thanks to all of you for sharing your reflections in the chat. We're going to just conclude this little section of our time together with a simple liturgy, which I'm going to share on my screen in a second so that you can all participate. Okay, so you'll see there's some words in bold, and just to invite you to join along with the bold text. Lord, we know that you are good. Your steadfast love endures, your faithfulness to all generations. You continue to show us your goodness right here in this place. You see the signs of your life and coming kingdom in the places we live, work, and worship. Lord, we know that you are good. Lord, awaken us to your presence. You call us to another way of being in the world, to your way of loving, living, and being with neighbors. Lord, awaken us to your presence. In the stories we receive from people in our everyday lives, may we listen with the expectation that you are present. Lord, awaken us to your presence.
Thanks, Fiona. So there's some more comments coming, and we'll share some more of those afterwards, even in the Facebook group, if any of you are interested. We're going to move now from listening to God through the text, and we want to keep the text with us. So as we move into this next section where we're going to be listening to a few stories, and then moving on to Alan and Marilyn doing some of their own reflecting and listening, the text will stay with us as we do that. So we want to listen to God through each other's stories, and we have a very simple question that we've asked just a few folks that signed up for the webinar to share with us. And part of why we're doing this is the Emmaus Road story captures a lot of what we're experiencing right now. And we want to invite a couple folks to just share a little bit about their experience so that we can use those stories and hold those stories and make space for those stories, because we're all experiencing lots of different things right now. And these stories are sort of windows and ways into us sort of naming and beginning to discern and listen to what God's up to amongst all of our many stories. So the question that we've asked a few folks to share with us, a very simple question. It's what's something that has happened in your congregation or your neighborhood this last week that has brought you joy or sorrow? So simple question, what's something that has happened in your congregation or neighborhood that is this week that has brought you joy or sorrow? So Cam, why don't you invite our first, we just have a small group of storytellers that are going to share with us.
Yeah, and Sarah Jane, I think the thing to underline is that we heard God speak to us in the text, and now we listen to what God's saying to us in these other stories. And so we're going to invite Julianne, and then Paul, and then Deb to come and share their stories. Lots of us are out west this time, so we have Calgary and Edmonton and Vancouver represented. But Julianne, why don't you why don't you start? It's good to have you with us, and we'd love to hear where you've seen God at work in your neighborhood in the last little bit.
Julianne, we've just promoted you to speak. Can you hear? There
Yeah,
you are.
there
Look
she
at
is.
that.
I just had to hit the red button. Thank you for asking. I had a little trouble with the joy and the sorrow, so I'm going to share a little bit of both. My story is that there's lots of stories to choose from, but Tuesday morning I got a call from a woman who said her dad was in palliative care. The long-term care home has COVID, not sure I can get in, not sure I should go in because I've been isolating. And her request was that I make sure that he get anointed with oil, which is actually not part of our practice, but someone did it for her mom, so she wanted me to come and do that. Well, given that I wasn't allowed in and as I said, I've been isolating, it was a very, very sad moment for me because as a pastor, that's what you do. You go and help people when they ask you to and walk with them through some of those very difficult times. So what happened was I said, well, here, I'll send you the words and you can do it. And then it occurred to me that I could do it on the phone with her. And so I led the service on the phone I could hear him breathing. So he was in with me, or he was hearing me. And what happened was this forced new way of caring for another meant that the surprise was, which is the joy, that this woman, probably in her mid-60s, was so moved by being able to anoint her dad. I said the words and she marked him with the cross. It was more meaningful to her, but it also allowed her she said something about, you don't have to be a pastor to do this. And I said, you absolutely don't. So it was this inclusion of her in this important thing for dad and that she's able to participate. And that was the joy thing. It wasn't about who the person was. It was about God and the heart. So that's my story.
Thank you, Julianne.
You're welcome.
We're going to head north to Edmonton and invite Paul. Paul, why don't you come on in? I think we're going to bring your face up to the front of the screen as well and invite you to share your story of where you've seen God. There's a joy or a sorrow in your neighborhood. So I think we're getting Paul. There he is.
Am I on?
We can hear you, Paul. We can't quite see you yet, but
Well, maybe I should press something. I don't know.
You just need to activate your camera.
Yeah, if you've got the button to activate your camera, that'd be great. Otherwise, we'll hear your story with just your name there. That's all right too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I live in a community in Williams Lake. That's just north of Vancouver, and it's a small community. But there's some things that I've noticed that when this started, there was a lot, I think, of people that were bewildered by what's happening, and there was a lot of uncertainty. But in the last week, I've noticed a shift. Now people are feeling really bored. Right? There's a sense of boredom, and people are wanting to get out and all this stuff. But I think there's also a sense that I begin to notice in my conversation with my friends and the people that I hang with. There was just a new sense, I think, of a openness to be real. I'm not saying that that's a common thing, but there's a slight opening there that when you talk to people, they want to get down to the real stuff. And it's not like before where you do the jive and a dance trying to get to the hot issue. Now they just want to talk, right, about the really hot issue. And that's been really kind of an encouraging thing, although we're still isolated and all that stuff, but just a new way of people wanting to get to know, to share what they're carrying. And I think it leads me to the question of, how can I be a neighbor to them, given this new sense of openness that I'm sensing. And that's just that's what I'm sensing myself. So I don't know if that's common, but in my conversation with people, it does not take long when I sense, and if I listen, they're wanting to talk more about deep substantial stuff. And that's just a new thing that I'm sensing. So that's my story.
Paul, thanks so much for that. That was wonderful and a great help to us. Wish we could have seen your face, but we heard your good words, so we
Next
listened to
time.
Jesus speak in the midst of that. So thank you for
Thank
that.
you.
So our third storyteller, and we're again listening for Jesus to speak in the midst of all this, is Deb Judas. Deb works at an MB church out in Richmond, lives in Surrey. Deb, welcome. Love to hear. Deb's out in her backyard. Beautiful sunshine in Vancouver. Did we mention that earlier? So Deb, tell us your story.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. Just when this question was asked of me, I have to make the connection because the journey actually started last summer when our leadership, we felt a real call to fast and pray for the spiritual awakening of our city. And so we put a call out to our church to do just that. So all summer long, we were fasting and praying every Tuesday. During the fall and winter, a smaller group through various initiatives continued on with these practices. And then even just in January, we did 21 days of prayer for the renewal of our city. And now we have just come through Lent, where we all participated in practices of a similar nature. And we've just come out this week, and I heard someone say a couple of days ago, this was the lentiest Lent we've ever had. And in the midst of this pandemic. And through all of this, I see how God has been preparing us for the last several months and strengthening our church. Because this week, the outpouring, the reaching out, the asking for more, that spiritual longing and that hunger has grown exponentially. And to be in isolation from one another, unable to gather together and actually physically touch each other and see each other, has really deepened the hunger. And so to have your whole congregation asking for more it's just brought such joy in such a sorrow-filled circumstance. And so I guess for me, seeing the spiritual awakening is just the beginning, but I see it.
Thanks, Deb. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Those were good stories, Sarah Jane. We're gonna shift again, I think, to our third section, aren't we? Can I introduce Alan and Marilyn? Would that be all right?
Let's do that.
So they have been being quiet for the first 35 or 40 minutes or so here, and we want to invite them into the conversation, longing to hear their reflections and what God might be saying. So we have these two guests. I don't really think I probably need to introduce many of you to them, but Alan Roxburgh, of course, we know him from his writings, from his teachings, and I've always said of Alan that I think Alan has such a prophetic voice. He seems to be 20 years ahead of us all, and has said some very helpful, very important things. Part of the original gospel in our culture network here in North America that has been so influential in the shaping of the missional movement here in North America. Of course, he teaches all kinds of places around the world, and we're just delighted, Alan, for you to weigh in on this conversation here in Canada. We've always wanted your voice more here in Canada. And then Marilyn Draper. Marilyn teaches at Tyndale, and it's been a delight for me the last couple of years to meet Marilyn. We've probably bumped into each other at various events for longer than that, but just getting to know Marilyn a little bit more. And if Alan has had a voice for the last 20 plus years here in Canada, I think we're going to hear much, much more of Marilyn in the next 20 years. For some of the writing and teaching and stuff that she's doing is so helpful for what I think God's doing in the church here in Canada. So Marilyn, we're so happy for you to join us here together on our call today. So just want to open this up and allow you guys to begin to weigh in what you've heard in the text, what you've heard from our stories, what you're hearing starting to bubble to the surface. We'd love to get you guys started on that, and we'll ask some other questions in a little while.
Okay. Well, Marilyn, you and I did this together a couple of days ago. So again, I just invite you to kick it off for us.
Well, today we have a lot of questions. I just was kind of writing down some questions as people were mentioning them. But how do we function differently now as a church? What does it mean to be a neighbor in this time? How do we provide more if people are asking for more when we can't even be together physically? So those were just kind of the most recent 3 questions out of the other ones that were asked. So Alan, do you want to pick one of those and get us started?
Give me the questions again, the 3 of them. How do we
function differently now?
Yeah.
How do we be a neighbor? And how do we provide more?
Let me jump in then around how do we function differently. I'm assuming that the we functioning differently has to do with a lot of us as clergy, pastors who are here on that, and connect it with how do we be a neighbor. I went out for a long walk this morning and was struck again by the ways in which all kinds of people, whether it's in windows or on streets or on writing in chalk on the wall, are expressing energy and hope, even in the midst of the sense of being, put aside, that sort of thing. The other thing I'm aware of is that people are talking about such very, very ordinary things, like, guess who I talked to in a supermarket today? Look what's happening around the corner in our hospital, or just across the street. Or I had a friend the other day, yesterday I was talking to him, and he said on their street, they sent letters out, he and his wife, to everybody on the street saying, we know these are issues. We know some of you might be lonely. Let us know how we could connect. And he got an email from a guy up the street that he didn't know. And the guy said, would you go for a walk with me? So there's all these amazing things happening. And so that gets to my response to how do we behave differently as leaders and clergy? I think it's not so much being concerned about keeping what we're doing going, whether that's, meetings on Zoom or services on Zoom. It's how do we listen more intently to the way the Spirit is already fermenting all this incredible life amongst people and our people. So that would be one quick response, or maybe not too quick. How about you?
Yeah, as I was thinking about how we do things differently, I was noticing just how people are more rooted in their neighborhoods, I think, than they have been for a little bit. I'm not in Vancouver. I'm just outside Toronto. And so I live in a place where people tend to go back and forth into Toronto constantly. And now people are here again. And I think when we moved into our neighborhood 20 years ago, we started church planting, and we were walking our neighborhood praying, trying to get to know the people who often weren't here. And now 20 years later, we know them, we know their faces, and we watch their children grow up, but they're here again now. And so this has been a lot of opportunities to stop as we're walking dogs, or just as we're walking, and pass greetings across the street. But I'm noticing people are in touch via text, right? To make sure that, does anybody need something? Does anyone, offering, right? Can we get you groceries? Can we help out in some way? That there's a sense of, and maybe it was that move from, Paul had talked about right now, we're almost a sense of boredom. Can you give me an excuse to do something for you?
Yeah.
Because I want to actually have purpose and meaning. And I'm wondering if that's where our conversations are going now. What does it, if I'm not getting my identity from my job, if I'm not getting my identity from all the things that I'm doing, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose? Why am I here? And what's happening, and how do I process it? And
Yeah.
those are the questions that I'm thinking our neighbors are asking, but maybe not necessarily in words asking.
Yeah. And I think that turns around to, you're right, that some of the big questions, particularly for those of us who are clergy and pastors, are identity questions, because our identities, to a large extent, have been tied up in what we do through certain kinds of sacral, sacred activities in places called churches and meetings. And in a profound way, that's been taken away. And but it's, in terms of where we are, it's an invitation to actually discover different spaces for the way we work. So for example, I was saying to someone this morning, our understanding of the sacred has been predominantly inside church and what church things do and what people who are ordained do. Now, what I'm hearing in so many of these stories and other stories is a resacralization of the ordinary. In walking through the streets, in bumping into people in, shops and other places. It's in things and people that people are discovering holy places. And so again, I think the opportunity, particularly for clergy, is to ask very different questions about role in the midst of this.
And I think one of the key things that I get from what you're saying is the slowing down. Because we're slowing down as we're waiting to go to a grocery store, we're noticing what's happening around us.
Right.
Because we're slowing down, leaving the grocery store, it gives us time to stop and thank the cashier before we leave. Because we're noticing who's on the street and how close we are, we're actually paying attention. Oh, these are the people who are out around us. And so then that does give us the opportunity to focus on the ordinary and to think about what does it mean that God is here present in this moment.
Yeah.
And to reconnect with the sacred in the moment.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm also wondering if it connects to these things. It was interesting on Tuesday's conversation, what people were noticing was the hope. We had hoped, we had hoped, we had hoped. And today I was noticing more the thought of these things. And I personally, when we were read it, went, oh yeah, these things is repeated a lot. And I thought, is this an opportunity for us to connect with the story, right? Jesus says, was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? And so I found myself focusing on this contrast between suffering these things and the glory. And that's very much the space that I've found myself in as I've been connecting with different pastors and different people this week, is going from someone who's just had a baby and celebration and the glory and the wonder of new life, and then someone else who's dealing with a death and not having able to been there, or they were there, but now we can't have a funeral. And this juxtaposition of suffering and glory, and what that looks like, both in our emotions and in how we maneuver as pastors. And I know Cam on Tuesday, you kept saying, let's be practical, let's be practical. And one of the things that struck me in the last couple of days since our last conversation was, in the past, we had physical opportunities. So if you were visiting someone in the hospital and it was a sadness and a grief, you could be there, you could be present, but then you had time in the car to process that before you visited the next person. And there was time and there was space. But now what's happening is we're having a call with one person and we're wanting to enter into their emotion, but then maybe 15 minutes later, we're on to the next Zoom call in a completely different space. And so what I've been encouraging people the last couple of days, specifically today, this morning, because it really just struck me yesterday, is to allow yourself time. Don't go from one Zoom call to the next Zoom call to the next Zoom call to the next Zoom call, but to give yourself a little bit of space in between to process and say, and give that to the Lord. Lord, I give you this conversation that I was just in, with all of its emotions, with its questions that aren't answered, and then pray and be then present in the next conversation. And just wondering if that will help us to navigate what we used to allow space. Now we need to allow the time to help us navigate.
I think too, both of us are reflecting on Kem's invitation that we be practical and not leave it up in the air. But let me try to be practical, building off what you're saying. My experience of conversations with clergy, which go on practically every day in groups and so, is that they remain largely preoccupied with the kind of things you're describing. Both, how do I visit my people? How can I do it when I can't visit with them? How might I take communion to them when they're shut in? What does visitation look like? How do I plan for the coming services? These are largely the preoccupations. And I would suggest in the midst of that, which are really about my roles and my identity, to begin playing with, and I use that word appropriately, simply becoming listeners of the conversations and the stories of our own people, in the expectation that amongst our people, there's lots of them discovering joy and adventure in the strangest places in the local. And to keep entering into those stories and encouraging them, like Jesus walking with these others. And then in the midst of that, simply asking the questions. I talked the other day about the Jesuit examen. What's been best about this experience? What's been most struggling? Where are you hearing God in the midst of this? So shifting the concerns from how do I do the things I'm supposed to be doing to a very different focus on what's actually going on in the stories of my people.
That's one of the things that when I teach the examen to my students, one of the things that they often like is the fact that they can carry it throughout the day. You can begin your day with setting it up, Lord, as I approach the day, may I be conscious of you, and then coming right at morning break. Once again, reviewing the morning, looking ahead at lunchtime, middle of the afternoon, at the end of the day. And some of them have said that that's been a very helpful practice, because so often in evangelical land, we just have that quiet time in the morning, and that's what set us up for the day. Whereas the examen is something that we can come back to so that we really have a sense that God is walking with us through the day. And I think what we're talking about is we're talking about reimagining, being reoriented. So we're trying to do all those tasks that need to be done as pastors, as Christian leaders, but we're also thinking about imagining what is next. Jacques Ellul, I think it was in the 1970s. Jacques Ellul's a French philosopher, a Christian, a French writer, but even though he wrote from the 50s through to the 80s, he's got a lot to say of us now in terms of his prophetic voice. But I think it was in the 1970s, he started asking questions. He said, this is a really fluid time that we're living in. Why can't the church be ahead? Why does the church always need to be reacting defensively? And I think that that's a question for us to be asking now. Say, things are fluid, things are changing. Let's not as the church be defensive, but let's as the church have our imaginations awakened. And I think, Alan, what you're suggesting is part of the ways that our imagination can be reawakened is by listening to the stories of the people who are around us. They may be Christians, they may not be Christians yet. But then to be thinking about now, and how do their stories connect with the greater story?
Right.
How do their stories connect with these things that Jesus was talking about, the suffering turning to glory? And then what might that look like for the Canadian church moving forward?
And that whole question of what's next, we have to be cautious with that question, because all the temptations of us as professionals who are trained is to begin thinking, what do we come up with what's next? And I think that's a trap we want to avoid, and avoid the pragmatism of fix it, we've got the answer. At the same time, we've got to ask the question. But there's a couple of things for me, and I want to be hopeful here, but there's a couple of things for me in response to that. One is, I don't think it's possible for us to hear God and address that question from inside the roles of clergy out of which we currently practice. And the opportunity is, it's those very roles that are being taken away from us right now. And it's creating a space. I think the second thing that gets in the way of us asking what's next is the picture, particularly those of us as clergy, that we've developed when we look at the culture, the society in which we live. The language we use is language of, we are exiles in this, we are marginalized. And I think that kind of narrative no longer describes the world in which we live now. And therefore, part of what's next is how we take on a different imagination about who we are as God's people in a culture that's become wide open to multiple kinds of stories. So there's lots of work to be done. And in a sense, the virus is part of a gift of disintegration that's helping us go there.
Yeah, in some ways, I have pushed against that exile imagery for a while.
Yeah.
In teaching in my church planting classes, we would talk about what it is required to set up a charity. And we would actually look at what the Canadian government says as part of its qualifications for a charity. And the Canadian government says, well, one of the reasons is the propagation of religion is a valid reason for a charity. So all along, the Canadian government has said, we think that churches are valid. And if you simply want to exist in order to share your faith, that's valid.
Yeah.
So we've always had that access in terms of the government giving us a voice. Sometimes I think we are the ones that have felt like we haven't had a voice. But in terms of the government, just this morning, my husband has a fascination with the Canadian Revenue Agency and charities.
Oh, he does.
And this morning, he went back through statistics. So from January the 1st to March 14th of this year, 343 new Christian charities applied and were given charitable status.
Wow.
However, in that same time, we had 673 removals of charitable status for Christian organizations. The majority, now he didn't have time to go through and sort out which ones were organizations and which ones were congregations. He felt that the majority were congregations. So obviously, even before, and we've been seeing this trend for a while, the number of congregations has been declining.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that becomes our focus, right? We just want to get the numbers back.
Yeah.
And I think what this is, this opportunity is now for us to say, this isn't about the numbers. This is about God doing something deep in our midst, so that when we're allowed to be together again, we don't just run and do the same old, but to be saying, what does it actually mean to be walking with God at this time? And that's where I think Deb's question comes in. How do we provide more? So we're actually phrasing the questions a little bit differently than maybe we were a few months ago.
Yeah. Part of whether this gets at what you're hinting at in that, how do we do more, is that in asking the question, what do we do more, what I'm suggesting is we're not going to answer that question by having meetings inside our churches. Mm-hmm. We're going to answer that question as we dig more deeply into what I think is already happening. Like what the virus has done is, in its confinement, is brought us back into our neighborhoods, and it's brought us back into connection with people. And so when we're asking the question, how do we do more as God's people? Again, I don't want to push a broken record. It's moving, it's moving into engagement with the people in the communities. That's where we hear God. So when you raise the question, how do we do more? And George is asking this, more what? It seems to me, how do we attend in a more focused way to what God is doing in the midst of what we're experiencing? That was the Emmaus thing, what Jesus came with. And what many people said in the dwelling was, Jesus turns up in the ordinary, with the ordinary bread and food. So to me, the doing more is how we form our people to be comfortable and at ease and celebratory in the local, in the neighborhood, in the shop, with the people, listening and answering to their stories. That's where we discern what God is doing. So that for me is about what doing more is about.
And basically, actually, from what Deb was saying, it's not even doing more, but it's about the being, right? I think that that's really what she was getting at. And obviously, you and I are very much aligned with it's what we do comes out of who we are and how we've been shaped in terms of our discipleship is going to very much then determine the activities, but we don't start with the activities. And I think that that's what this opportunity provides for us. It allows us to say, what have we been doing? Why have we been doing it? And who are we? What is the church? What does it mean to be the church? What does it mean to be community? Because even now when we're talking about the neighborhood, and I think we're being rooted in neighborhood in two different ways. We're being rooted in our physical neighborhoods because that's where we actually want to get out and walk and get some fresh air. And for you guys who don't have snow, but to actually enjoy the sunshine. But it also means our other neighborhoods are our online neighborhoods because we're seeing a deepening of relationship. And I think this is where the millennials can really be helping us as well, because they see a level of authenticity in these virtual relationships. And so these neighborhoods online can be as real and as authentic and as deep as the neighborhoods that we're experiencing in our physical life as well.
I think lots of people are discovering that. I want to go back a little bit to that because it's always a tension, and I always feel it, that the doing and the being. And I want to link it to something we said earlier. Jesuits, I was trained by Jesuits, and their liturgies, their practices, they call it learning practices on one foot. In other words, their being was always being discovered in their doing because they were a missionary people on the way. And again, I think that's a critical piece that too often across our churches, we've separated these things out, that there's spiritualness, there's quietness, there's going inward, all of that stuff the clergy become very good at. But I think we need a different kind of being, a being that is constantly on one foot as we are present in the local, in the concrete every day. That's where these two things come together. And again, that's pressing into what I think are the opportunities of the moment that we've got.
And the other piece that that has been kind of hinging around the edge of our discussion is the whole aspect of relationship with one another, but also how does that affect our relationship with God? That I think a lot of our mission has been God is useful.
Oh yeah.
Right? I have my program and then God, you bless it. God, you've got my back.
Yeah.
And for us to switch that around and say, God, you don't exist for our purposes, right? That's what the disciples on the road to Emmaus, right? Our hope was that you would redeem Israel. You would come along and you would do something for us. You would fit in with our plan and our agenda. And Jesus said, no, it's not your plan and your agenda. It's about me and who I am and how knowing me in the midst of this. And so it's actually what does it mean for my congregation or for me as an individual to actually have Jesus walking with me as I suffer or as I'm trying to sort this out or as my congregation's trying to figure the way out. And how does that aspect of relating then help to shape us differently as we're moving ahead so that God is not useful, but that God is actually leading the charge and in our relationship, carrying us along with that plan and with that purpose.
Al, I'm not sure if you're wanting to respond to that, but I just wanted to invite folks to there's some great conversation going on in the chat, just invite you to be posing some questions as well. If there's particular questions coming out of the scripture and story and some of what Al and Marilyn have been sharing, if there's particular questions, please do have them in the chat and we'll read those out and invite Alan and Marilyn to continue engaging with those.
Alan, were you gonna follow up to what Marilyn just asked, or were you taking a pause?
I was taking a pause.
Okay. So while people are starting to do more questions, there's some really good stuff in the chat, and I think it'd be helpful for us to focus on that in a minute. But let me prime it with one more. I've got a big smile on my face because the conversation is fantastic. It's also the second time we've done it, which means the first time on Tuesday, Sarah Jane and I had to feed you all kinds of questions to keep you going. I think we could let you two go for the next hour and a half and it wouldn't be a problem. But okay, here's what I want to poke at just a little bit. So come back to the text. There's a reason that we chose this text. It's so appropriate, not only post-Easter, but in the midst of the context that we're in right now. And we started this first conversation around the question of where do we find ourselves in the story, or where are we now? And almost identifying with these two disciples. Forget who it was earlier that said, well, are we sure it was two men, maybe husband and wife? But anyway,
Sure. Yeah.
okay. Wonderful point. A totally discombobulated situation where they're leaving Jerusalem, not knowing what in the world's coming. So in the midst of that, we see them discover Jesus through the unpacking of the text, through the practice of hospitality, through the breaking of bread, and through the burning in their hearts. Those four pieces we see in the text. I would love each of you to pick one and maybe talk about it a little bit in terms of what we need to pay attention to now, in terms of, I mean, this whole conversation is around discerning where God's at work and participating with him. So how do one of those pieces, how do they help us do that discernment? Where do you see that as important for our life together in the churches right now?
I think that I'm going to pick a different one, and you can tell me not to.
It's okay.
But the other thing that's powerful, at least plays for me, is this confession that they make, but we had hoped. And in response to your question, it seems to me that what was going on in the disorientation of these two people, husband and wife, or two others, is that the things in which they had hoped and made Jesus the container of it had been smashed by his crucifixion. And you can imagine what it is they had hoped in, because the Gospels give you all kinds of clues, like the return of Israel to power and all that sort of stuff. And I think that one of the pieces for me is that what's going on right now, particularly amongst clergy, and I'm one of those, so I'm not standing outside taking pot shots, is that we have been formed, particularly in our schools, in our denominations, in what I call a clergy industry, to function in certain roles and with certain kinds of technical rationality, which meant that if we figured things out well and we did them right in our roles, we would get the goals that we want. That hope has been massively disrupted. And I think many are feeling it's not coming back. And so what the text is giving us is a way of saying, we're in a space that's massively disrupting us. And it's not going to be fixed by us working harder to put our worship services online or other sorts of things. It's calling us into a very different kind of identity and role. I think that's, to me, is the primary thing I'm picking up as I talk to clergy about what's coming out of this text.
Marilyn, what about you?
Wow. I'm not sure where to begin. But my first thought is to respond to Alan, because I have shifted from church planter to teaching pastor to actually seminary professor, and realizing that a lot of my thinking lately has been actually rethinking theological education and how do we go about that. But I think that's a conversation that we'll leave for another day.
Yeah.
Because I too have been thinking about this certainty that I've been finding as I talk with pastors, a bit of a holding back, because we want to figure it out and we want to know how we're doing it right. And to just giving people the freedom to say, we don't know how to do it right. So how about coming up with some different scenarios, start one, and then, changing and correcting as you go along, and that being completely acceptable. Yeah. But now I actually need to get back to Cam's question about the text itself. And as we were reading through it today, what was striking to me is I thought often when we put ourselves on the road to Emmaus, we think that, yeah, but resurrection had already happened. They just needed to know about it.
Right.
And here we are, right? We know about the crucifixion and we know about the resurrection. So what does this mean for us? But the ascension hadn't happened yet. And I was thinking they were in this state of confusion and wondering. And we thought, well, they just needed to know the end of the picture. They just needed to know that Jesus had resurrected. But that wasn't the end of the story, because yes, Jesus had resurrected, but he was still going to ascend. And that was a key piece. It wasn't until Jesus could ascend that the Spirit could come. And that's where we are right now. So Easter was last weekend, but Ascension Day isn't until the middle of May. We will probably see a little bit of opening, be able to get out just around the time that Ascension Day actually happens. And I'm wondering this year, right, we've already been through Lent. We felt Lent was Lent. We felt like Easter wasn't really Easter. But maybe this year, instead of putting the emphasis on the resurrection, and I don't want to take anything away from the resurrection, I agree with the Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, that the resurrection is key. But I also think that the ascension is really, really important. And we tend to just kind of skip over it because it doesn't happen on a Sunday. But maybe this is the year for us to think, what are the implications of ascension? When Jesus broke that bread in the midst of them, when they thought to show him hospitality, but when he became the host and he showed them hospitality, was he saying, this is a picture ahead to ascension. Ascension is Jesus truly being acknowledged as king. Jesus in the heavenly realms, the king of the kingdom, is going to be acknowledged as king of the kingdom. And so what does that mean for us today? That Jesus is king, that we are part of his kingdom, and it's obviously not unfolding the way that we anticipated. But what are the aspects of Jesus' kingdom that we can experience here and now? And what does it mean that we long for his kingdom to come in its fullness? And I think maybe that gets back to that question of providing more, that longing for more of who is Jesus? What does it mean to be walking with the Spirit? What does it mean for Jesus to be the king of the kingdom and for us to be part of that kingdom?
I wanted to read a comment from Jeff Cook. Chad Myers suggests that Emmaus was a safe house, a village that was a gathering place for those particularly opposed to the Roman Empire. The two disciples were fleeing the place of uncertainty to the place of safety. But after encountering the resurrected Christ, they go back into the place of marginalization and risk. Perhaps we are being called away from our safe places.
I couldn't say it better. Or let me put it in a different way. Chad, you said it way better than I could. I think you're absolutely right.
And then Oliver has this question: what are the marks and characteristics of the new clergy roles besides listening and engaging in the neighborhoods?
I'm going to be totally facetious. My colleague, Marklau Branson, who teaches at Fuller Seminary, and I have just finished a book called A Theology of Mission that will be published in October. That, this is what me being, will answer all those questions. That, I mean, getting into that is, that's a question that would take us a long time to talk about here.
Can you give us a bit of a preview, Alan, of what's going to come?
Well,
or perhaps the context is in terms of where we are now, and we're not looking for, I don't believe what we're wanting to do is have a roadmap that says, here's the 10 things you need to be looking for. But in terms of right now, in the very next steps we're taking, where we are on this road, on this Emmaus road, where we are, what are we paying attention to? It's back to the text. What are the things, where are our eyes being opened and our ears being opened? What are the revelations that we need to be paying attention to as leaders right now?
The question is, what's the clergy role? That's kind of the question. And so some of the ways I would respond out of what we've written connects with what Marilyn's been saying. One, it is a focal recovery of the practices of things like the daily office and the examen, not as, and again, I'll beg forgiveness ahead of time, not as some kind of internal spiritual thing for Christians to do with themselves. It's about how we journey and be present in our neighborhoods and communities. Secondly, it is about a huge role for clergy in how do we give back to our people the sense that it is in their stories and in their engagement that God is already present. It's not about joining the stuff that we've set up in the churches, but God's already present. So what are the practices for doing that? It's about, and I'm going to stop here, but even now, it's about bringing people together. I've said this over and over again, in conversation around stories, to create learning communities that begin to cultivate action reflection about what they're doing. It's all these sorts of things. So there's huge work for the ordained to do. I mean, I hate that language, but those are the directions in which it goes.
And I'm wondering, just from what I've seen, maybe less emphasis on the clergy and more emphasis on the laity, those who aren't ordained, right?
Yes.
So that those who discover that I can be part of the group that baptizes someone else. I can be someone who anoints someone else. I can be, I'm wondering if preaching might change a little bit. Instead of me being the key teacher who needs to pass along important information, I've been noticing there's in Zoom times, there's less emphasis on the preaching, and it's more on listening to one another's stories and how, more like what we did today, having opportunities for us to share the text and then for us to talk about it as the text. And we still need that education. We still need those people who've read the commentary so that we're not just all sharing our ignorance.
Absolutely.
But we're sharing that deep biblical and theological understanding, but then people are able to connect it to their stories more effectively.
Rich Faulkner also just has a comment and a question here is this a call for us to be focused on building spiritual maturity, being ready to journey with those given us, just as Jesus met the two on the road? He met them in their space, not his, a model for the church moving forward?
These are very quick responses to questions, but I would restate the question a little differently. I think to focus on building spiritual maturity, to me, has inside of it, let's begin there and do that, then we can do this. And Rich may not mean that. I would say you build spiritual maturity on the road. You build spiritual maturity when you create safe spaces for people to risk connecting with the other. Those are the spaces of spiritual maturity. The reason is because when I begin to connect with the other, not as an object of what I've learned, but as another person, then all kinds of questions are going to pop up that are going to be asked that I've never confronted before. And when I bring those questions back into my Christian community, then I'm learning, but I'm learning off what I've experienced. Again, it's being a Jesuit, doing practices on one foot as we go.
The other shift that I think might be is away from hierarchical structures, which will then possibly allow for, because of course the other mention that we've made, right, was it two men or was it a man and a woman?
Yeah.
We know from John 19 that the wife of Cleopas was at the crucifixion, right? So this could have been Mary and Cleopas together. So it could have been a husband and wife. It could have been a man and a woman. And is this an opportunity for men and women to think about how can we partner together more effectively in terms of being the community of faith in our neighborhoods going forward?
Sarah Jane, can I raise one that's here on the chat? So my friend Simeon Baker from Wales makes this great comment, and I want to read the comment in a second, but tie it back to what we were talking about on Tuesday and have talked about today, the prophetic. So I'd love Marilyn or Alan to maybe make a comment on this, but Simeon says, our clergy are doing more now than they've ever done before to keep the whole thing turning. But our communities are doing more with each other because they have space to walk, talk, exercise, even sleep more. And then he makes the comment, the UK government is afraid people won't want to go back. And I said, back to what? He says, back to an economic system that feeds a consumer culture with all the implications for taxation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do you want to comment on that, particularly from a prophetic?
I'll make two comments. I think his description of what clergy are doing is, in my experience, is exactly what's going on. And it has to do with the whole identity piece and role piece. And there's deep anxiety because at another level, they're sensing what's happening amongst ordinary people. So I would completely agree. I think the things that are getting missed, and this is not part, not part of this, this webinar in some senses, but the things that are getting missed, and he's making the point, is actually, I'm in conversation every week with, I'm not going to give you the name, someone who is inside the cabinet of the Conservative Party in the UK. And they are deeply aware that the fundamental basis of neoliberal capitalism simply can't carry us forward into a new future. Now, they don't know what the answers are, but this is an unbelievable opportunity for us as God's people to ask, I think of Catholic social teaching, of how do we begin to pursue and seek the common good? Because neoliberal capitalism is about eviscerating the local and the neighborhood, of taking away all the systems of the local and the neighborhood and putting it elsewhere in globalization, to people from anywhere. We have the opportunity, particularly as leaders, to ask, how do we look at ways of reinvesting in the common good in our local neighborhoods in the name of Christ? So this is an amazing space into which we find ourselves at this point in time.
If we go back to Jacques Ellul again, he talked in the 1970s about, he saw the trajectory that we were on.
Yeah.
And he talked about the problems of technique. And the problem of technique is really an overemphasis on efficiency and everything being run through that lens of, is it efficient and is it effective, right? It's efficacy and efficiency. And it was interesting. I had a student who was approached by a Christian organization a while ago to take on a position. And she asked them all sorts of questions, had several sets of interviews, and then came back to me and she said, I decided not to take the position. And I said, why? And she said, because I was thinking about the values that we've been talking about in class. And she said, everything that this organization was doing was through the lens of effectiveness and efficiency. And she said, I just couldn't align myself to those values because I didn't think that that's what God's calling me to do. So I said no. And it made me think that's the role of the prophetic voice.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is God calling us to do? God calls us to right relatedness. And so what does that right relatedness look like in terms of our local area, in terms of our communities, in terms of the environment? And so that gives us opportunities to be really reframing how we're thinking about church and mission. And where God might be taking us from here.
Yeah, right. I would encourage everybody, and these are not because we're sorry, but I reread Jacques Ellul's The Presence of the Kingdom every year. And it was written right after the Second World War. And I would encourage people, particularly this whole question that Marilyn is lifting up about technique, that I'll just say what I think is that our seminaries and our denominations basically came together in the 20th century to form a model of ministry which is about technocratic elites and technocratic rationality. And until that one is addressed, which I think you're pointing to, the clergy that we're producing will not have the capacity to engage the world that's opening up before us.
And I like to think that we're having a lot of those conversations as a faculty at Tyndale. And so we are moving in some new directions.
Good.
Just let you get that one in there, Marilyn. Good, well done.
Well, yeah, I don't want to think, because I'm actually thinking that if people have the opportunity to take courses, I don't want to chase them away from theological.
No.
Ah! Oh, gosh.
Well, this is being extremely rich, and I want to honor people's time and recognize that we're spending a lot of time in front of our screens these days. And so we really appreciate you taking some of your time and spending it with us. I want to let you know that we are going to be continuing this conversation, and you folks have all registered and joined us today. So you're going to have a special invitation to the next conversation, and that'll be coming out early next week. So we'd ask you just to look for that if you're interested in continuing the conversation. We are also continuing the conversation on Facebook, where we have created an open book an open group. And maybe Fiona could share that link, which you need to probably copy and just post in a URL or post in your browser. And there's already been some good energy there and some sharing of pieces. So we want to find ways to continue this conversation. Where are we at? What are we learning? How are we discerning what God is doing and saying amongst us now? How are we opening up our eyes and our ears to what Jesus is doing and saying to us as we walk along this road together? So so please do visit that Facebook page and look for an invitation to a next conversation next week. Cam, would you like to bless us, close us off as we go our separate ways?
Yeah, let me pray for us as we go. And so, Father, we say thank you. Thank you for one another. Thank you for the story that you have given us in the text, for the story that you've given us in the way you speak through one another, and through the rich conversation that we have had. We've heard you speak in different ways, and we bless you for it. Lord, one of the things we love about our Canadian context is that we're a size of country that allows us as followers of Jesus to often not worry so much about denominational boundaries, but find ways to work together. And looking at the list of people who are here today, we've seen that and we've sensed that, and we ask you for more of that, because we very much do not want to be people that have all the answers. We want very much to be asking the questions that you're leading us into. And so we bless you for that. We pray, Lord Jesus, how can we not pray for your protection over our country and over the countries represented on this call in terms of the coronavirus? But we also pray your protection, Lord Jesus, that in this time we would not be sitting waiting till we can go back to same old, but we would listen, we would search, we would be longing to hear your voice on this journey, on this road. And so we thank you for that as well. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
Bless you guys all for coming. Alan and Marilyn, thank you so much for your input. Very, very helpful for us.
Great fun. Thank you, Marilyn.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
It's fun.